this because he's an investigative reporter for the Government Accountability Institute. He also co-hosts a great podcast called The Drilldown. Welcome back, Eric Eggers.
Thank you, Alan. It's great to be with you.
We're going to be talking about collusion that takes place between federal agencies and the private sector. Among other things, it's collusion that's designed to suppress viewpoints from one side or the other. In recent years, that's typically meant anti-conservative voices that are burrowed through the government. We're also going to talk about the weaponization of agencies that engages the court system to obtain a desired and less than democratic election. Eric, we learned recently that this can go very high up in the government. There were documents uncovered that showed Attorney General Merrick Garland authorized the use of deadly force during the FBI's raid of Mar-a-Lago. That was when the special counsel went looking for classified documents, but in a far more aggressive manner than when they went to get President Biden's documents in his weekend house garage. That just doesn't seem possible in our nation, but we watched it happen.
No, I'm smiling and kind of chuckling because it's almost comical how egregious the double standard of justice is. The FBI likes to say, oh, well, it's standard protocol for us to authorize handcuffs, guns, and the use of deadly force when anytime you're serving a search warrant, and they just failed to take it away when they were looking for documents against former President Donald Trump. But obviously, they had a very different approach and different standard when they were serving essentially a warrant for the same thing or looking for the same thing against Donald Trump's political opponent, who happens to be the President of the United States. And I know that your viewers are smart enough to understand the differences there. Joe Biden has those documents because he was allegedly using them to work on his memoir, which, by the way, he was paid $8 million for. So his use of the document, there was some talk that Donald Trump was charging people to look at these documents in Mar-a-Lago. Joe Biden was literally making millions off of his access to things he shouldn't have had. And yet Donald Trump is the one that not only faced the threat of deadly force, but also faces actual criminal charges because of his possession. And that's one of a litany of examples of the double standard of justice that happens, which is a great example of the weaponization of the federal government that you're talking about.
Well, it's frustrating. Public exposure doesn't seem to change or alter the behavior. Is there any form of discipline that can be brought to bear when we see these kind of inconsistencies happen?
I think it's one reason why it's good that we have a balanced form of government in terms of you have Democrats in charge of the Senate, but Republicans in charge of the House. Because I think some of the more interesting things we've learned that the media hasn't reported on have actually come from these Republican-led House oversight committees. You hear whistleblower testimony from people like the IRS agents who were said that they were told by FBI and DOJ officials not to talk to Hunter Biden, not to use certain last names on certain search warrants, and they were kept from looking at key pieces of information. But we only know that because you have two different parties who are pursuing two different agendas. And so the Republican agenda in the House, I think, has been to expose potential crimes committed by the Biden family, or at least a lack of due process been followed in investigating those crimes or alleged crimes. And so I think, we only know that because of public exposure. But I think, to your point, the fact that the media doesn't do the job that they were created to do is only going to embolden the bad behavior that we're seeing on other parts of federal agencies.
Well, I think skepticism and frustration are growing, but I'm curious, you're the authority. Do you think the behavior is worse than it's been in the past, or is there just a bit more exposure because of the whistleblowers and the watchdogs and such?
It seems more brazen, Alan. I mean, I think we're both of a certain age to remember that, Watergate scandals or things that they reported and people resigned because it seemed like it was the honorable thing to do. Fast forward to 2020, and you had, 2016, you had fake, documents passed around suggesting that Donald Trump was part of some Russian collusion plot. And then 24 years later, you had the FBI and DOJ actively suppress information that showed the Biden family was actually compromised in terms of information on Hunter Biden's laptop. And that was suppressed by the social media companies that work with the Biden administration and the DOJ. And, that would have been a massive violation in terms of election contribution. And now you have federal agencies that are prosecuting in a number of different ways Joe Biden's political opponent, which also seems like it would be a massive campaign contribution. I mean, Donald Trump can't leave the state to go campaign. So I've never seen it so brazen and so egregious, but I think there seems to be no accountability when one political party is in charge of the mechanisms of government.
Well, you mentioned social media, and it seems like in many ways they lead the charge, and a lot of times with not very much integrity. It's a concern to me that somebody in a basement with a camera can drive the initiative. What's our response to that? People that are influencers that we don't know are pushing national narratives that impact the direction of our nation. That can't be a good thing for our future.
Oh, it's a terrible thing for our future. And because of their alliance with the government and the Democratic Party specifically, I think they're able to get away with lots of things. I mean, this is not related to the weaponization of federal government, but in New York State right now, there's an effort to make the algorithms less addictive for children. And of course, the big tech companies are spending millions of dollars to keep that from happening. And because of their relationships with federal government, I think that there's a decent chance that they'll be successful in combating that. But you think about, like, they have this alliance with the mechanisms of government. Those influencers, those people in a basement with a camera may actually be getting the check that you and I are paying for, because we know the Biden campaign and the Biden administration hires these social media influencers to try to gin up or drum up support for the Biden campaign. Imagine people organically being enthusiastic about a president in his 80s. It doesn't really happen, but a check helps. So we know the Biden campaign is helping to do that. And the fact that federal government's paying people to do things like help generate voter registrations for key demographics that will likely support the president, there's a decent chance our tax dollars are supporting people in basements.
Well, the Republican-led House seems to be determined to make some kind of a difference. They even formed a House Judiciary Subcommittee on the weaponization of the federal government. It isn't clear to me whether they've been able to force any real change. What's your expectation? Is there going to be meaningful outcomes to that, or is that just more sound bites for people that maybe we like to listen to a little better?
So that's a great question. And I want to offer your audience some hope. So I think Jim Jordan from Ohio and the other members of that subcommittee are doing important work. And I think they're helping to kind of put together the puzzle pieces that just show this plot that once Donald Trump declared his candidacy for president, then that's when these charges started to begin. I mean, think about this. They had the White House Correspondents' Dinner not too long ago in Washington, D.C. They call it the Nerd Prom because it's when all the media elites come together, and when a Democrat president's in office, they have a comedian give a speech. And then, Joe Biden treated it like a campaign rally. But one of the people that walked the red carpet at this event, this confluence of government and media, was Fani Willis, the prosecutor in Atlanta, who, has some problems in terms of hiring her boyfriend to help prosecute Donald Trump. But she was in a dress, walking the red carpet, having media take her picture like she's a celebrity, right? She's not part of the media. She's not part of the federal government. Yet here she is at this event. And I think she has a certain status because she's doing the work of the Biden campaign, which is to keep Donald Trump out of the campaigns and in the headlines for negative reasons and facing criminal charges. So I think that just shows you the way that all the forces come together for one strategic political purpose. I don't necessarily think it's one that benefits the country.
Yeah, we seem to have lost any notion that justice is blind. Well, Eric, stay with us, please. We'll be back with more in just a moment. Welcome back. We're talking with Eric Eggers, the investigative reporter from the Government Accountability Institute. Eric, you mentioned House Republican Jim Jordan. We had some interesting blowback when he tried to shed some light on the racketeering investigation and indictment of former President Trump by the Georgia District Attorney, who's become kind of a national celebrity, Fani Willis. The day that Mr. Trump was booked and had his mugshot taken on 13 criminal felony counts, Jordan asked Willis to turn over all her records related to the case. He said that her actions, quote, raise serious concerns about whether they're politically motivated, end quote. Well, Congressman Jordan was subsequently accused of trying to weaponize the government himself by investigating a case of seemingly obvious weaponization. Well, if exposing this type of behavior doesn't seem to change it, is there a solution to this kind of open dishonesty? And do you have any idea where these solutions might come from? You're the expert. We'll listen.
Well, I think I may be somebody who reports on this and covers it for a living, but I think anybody, including someone who understands wisdom and truth like yourself and people who are watching this program, understand when they're being lied to. And I think, unfortunately, there's a certain element of hypocrisy and deceit that's taken root. I mean, think about this. You've got Donald Trump facing charges in New York from Alvin Bragg because of what's allegedly a political contribution, right? It's, he falsified records that amounts to some kind of illegal political contribution. when the prosecution of him in that instance, where you have, by the way, a former #3 official from DOJ who's helping to lead that prosecution in New York, that essentially amounts to a political contribution from the Biden administration, right, against Donald Trump. I mean, that is what it is. And so the weaponization of government that Jim Jordan's being accused of is only actually trying to expose the actual weaponization of government against Donald Trump, which anybody, I think, with common sense and an ounce of basic integrity can see. And I think so people just need to be able to trust their own eyeballs and trust their own instincts and understand just because the government says it's doing anything doesn't mean that's what's actually happening. And people that understand wisdom and truth, I think, should just lean on that and believe with their own eyes the information they're consuming and what it tells them.
Yeah, I think we're going to have to grow up a little bit. We're kind of hiding behind the idols of our political affiliation. I believe right and wrong still exists. I was young, but I'm old enough to remember barely the Watergate trials. And that really wasn't a partisan initiative. There was a sense that behavior had been wrong. And people on both sides of the aisle joined together to say, we won't accept that behavior from our government. And it brought some good things out of that. We're going to need that kind of adult leadership again. And maybe it has to start in our homes and stop waiting on Washington. I don't know.
Yeah, unfortunately, I think that there's a certain ideological mindset that's taken root in certain aspects of Washington, D.C. You talked about the deep state. And I think that there's clearly a double standard. Yeah. There happens to be one member of the House Democratic caucus who's facing ethics charges potentially. He happens to be the only pro-life Democrat in Congress, and he also happens to be an outspoken critic of the Biden immigration policy. And he's the one that faces potential challenges, even though you've got lots of questionable behavior by lots of other members of the political party. By the way, the thing he's accused of doing, which is kind of working as a foreign agent and accepting money from overseas despite adding no value, some would say is exactly the kind of thing that Hunter Biden has done for years, and yet faces no serious prosecution from Joe Biden's DOJ itself. So I think you're absolutely right. We've lost this sense of right and wrong. We've lost the willingness to call balls and strikes regardless of which team it benefits. There's clearly a rooting interest on behalf of the media for one team and a rooting interest against the other team. And it's in every criminal instance that we see these 4 cases that happened against Donald Trump and the lack of criminal prosecution against anybody who might be hurt by Donald Trump's ascendancy.
Yeah, I think you're so right. This double standard of justice, we're going to have to use our voices about this. We see riots in major American cities where federal buildings are burned and there's no charges proffered and there's really no arrests made. And then someone protests at an abortion clinic peacefully and federal charges are filed. I mean, again, that's your arena, but that can't be right.
It can't be right. It isn't right. Your audience knows it's not right. And oh, by the way, that person who faces 11 years in prison for singing and, just kind of praying peacefully outside the entrance to the abortion clinic faces no state charges. The police showed up, the person in question acted as an intermediary and then left peaceably only 22 months later to get a knock on the door from Joe Biden's FBI and face charges and now faces a prison term because, because he's a Christian. He said, listen, if the Lord wants me to be in prison, then I'll happily do that. But that doesn't mean the mechanisms of government that might make him face a prison term are correct or just. And that's just another example of the double standard. And I think that's one of the reasons why so many people are paying attention to this and saying, listen, this is not enough. This is not okay. This is not the country we knew growing up. And this is not the future we want for our children, the next generation, which is why I think programs like yours and the willingness to have honest conversations. I heard you say to your audience previously that, being willing to talk about religion, being willing to talk about politics, those are okay. Those are acceptable. Now, it may be uncomfortable at your dinner table, Alan, but I think it's probably better for the country long term. So I appreciate you doing that.
No, it's necessary. The last time I checked, we have a government of the people, by the people, and for the people. And the people should not be afraid of the government. We should not cower in fear when we think about having to interact with some government official or some government office. But unfortunately, I think we find ourselves that way, even at the local level. We're going to have to find a new kind of a voice, maybe coach us a little bit on how we can take that place in the midst of this. Stop waiting for Washington. Let's decide we're the difference.
No, you're absolutely right. I think it was Thomas Jefferson who said, you have a republic if you can fight enough to keep it, or something like that. And I think it's like, it's this form of democracy, this form of government relies on citizen participation. And citizen participation begins with courage. And I think you're absolutely right. We need to be willing to stand up for what's right. We have to be willing to engage in the process. I wrote a book about election integrity. Our election system requires citizens to volunteer. So we need to be willing to kind of reclaim our mantle, put down the smartphones, and pick up a faith and pride in citizenship and helping to steer the country in a better direction. Absolutely.
That's wise counsel. I thank you for that. Before we go, we suggest reading Eric's book, Fraud: How the Left Plans to Steal the Next Election. It's available in all the usual places, but we love it when you can support your local bookstores that still exist. Thanks for coming on our program tonight, Eric.
My pleasure, Alan. Congratulations and God bless.
In a moment, I'll have some final thoughts I'd like to share with you.